Hi, everyone. I'm Ellen Smith, and this is the Bacchae Lecture for Directed Studies. It will take just under an hour, and the images you'll see aren't exactly illustrations, but they will depict Dionysus and Maenads and satyrs and Sparagmos, the death of Pentheus. Most were painted shortly before or during Euripides' lifetime on classic black and red figure ceramic vases from ancient Greece. Two are from Pompeii, however, but please email me later if you'd like to talk about them with me. Now, there are many ways of reading literature, and my approach to the Bacchae is psychological. Modern psychology, after all, has deep roots that go back to ancient Greece, especially to the tragedies, for in them, the Greeks' probing of mental states is nuanced and intense. Even earlier than the tragedies, remember Achilles wavering as his anger pushes him towards murdering Agamemnon. His tormented premonition, even before he learns his beloved Patroclus has died. His pity for Priam, tempered by an awareness that to show him Hector's body might stir up uncontrollable grief or bring on unwarranted violence. In 1899, Sigmund Freud turned to Sophocles' Oedipus Tyrannus for his theory of the Oedipus complex. In a seminar in Greek tragedy I taught to psychiatrists and psychologists in training, they said they could hear patients' voices in the lines of the ancient plays. Euripides' life spanned the 5th century BCE, the golden age of Greece, and 19 of his plays survive, more than all we have by Aeschylus and Sophocles combined. Next term, we're going to read his Hippolytus, paired with a 17th century retelling by Racine called Phèdre. The Bacchae, however, sprang into being when the Peloponnesian Wars were drawing to a close, and the Athenians were suffering the loss of their hegemony and their democracy. Euripides wrote it at the end of his life in Macedonia. The Bacchae mirrors the tempestuousness of its time and calls to us from across the centuries as we grapple with the tempestuousness of our time and our struggles to preserve democracy. We can resonate with its sense of vertigo, as Agave says to Cadmus near the end of the play, when he delivers a grief-stricken eulogy over his grandson's body. Father, you see how my life is overturned. The Bacchae's invented world permits few stable reference. It is dominated by movement, swerving, twisting, turning over and around, and falling. Its images shift as readily as the figure of its protagonist, Dionysus, who appears in so many guises. He is an ambiguously gendered stranger, a formerly abandoned child born from his father's body after his pregnant mother's death, a roaring, thundering god, an advocate of frenzy and ecstasy, a clever sophist, a seducer, a theatrical director, a bull, a snake, a lion, and finally, a terrible avenger. He is also, of course, the ancient Greek god of theater, wine, and revelry. Quick summary first. We meet 5 named characters: Dionysus, Tiresias, whom we know already from the Odyssey and Antigone, Cadmus, Pentheus, Agave, then 2 messengers, and a chorus of women followers of Dionysus from Lydia in Asia Minor. The title Bacchae refers to the women of the chorus, as well as to the offstage frenzied women of Thebes, who are also called Maenads, mad women in Greek. And the action begins in Thebes when Dionysus returns to his birthplace, arriving in disguise. He comes seeking recognition of the god and the establishment of his rites of worship. And he's denied this by the rigid young king Pentheus, who denounces him as an impostor and expresses rage that the women have flocked to the hills to engage in orgies. Despite warnings from his grandfather, Cadmus, and from the blind seer Tiresias, Pentheus remains adamant. He's unaware that the so-called Lydian stranger is the god Dionysus, and he insults him and orders him captured and manacled. But in an apocalyptic scene, the stranger miraculously escapes and appears to shatter the palace in a thunderous explosion. He appears to the frenzied Pentheus as a bull, but neither persuasion nor threat nor even miracle dissuade the young king. And at last, he threatens military force. And now Dionysus changes tactics. Preying on what he detects as the young king's prurient urge to see the women at their revels, Dionysus leads him, cross-dressed as a Maenad, out of the city. Perched on a towering treetop, Pentheus himself cannot see below, but he is exposed. And the women, alerted by Dionysus that they are spied on, attack him. Led by Agave, they pelt the tree, bring him down, and fancying him a dangerous beast, they deliriously tear him limb from limb. Spartmos in the Greek. Agave returns to Thebes with her son's head on a pike, and Cadmus, horrified by his daughter's deed, guides her back to reality in one of the most affecting scenes in all of Greek tragedy. At the end, Dionysus banishes Agave and enchants her aged parents into serpents, and the house of Thebes is ruined. With Agave, we endure her father's disconsolate parting. Farewell, my forlorn daughter, although you cannot now farewell. Well, interpretations of the Bacchae sprout as lavishly as the ivy and vines which are sacred to Dionysus. And they come from stage directors, not just scholars. For the Bacchae is not merely a text to be analyzed, but a living play, and Euripides a brilliant dramatist. In fact, the Bacchae is one of the most frequently performed of all surviving ancient tragedies. By reading it psychologically, I hope to suggest reasons. In the past couple of years alone, at least 5 productions have occurred in the US that I know about. One here at Yale last year, one at the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis, and another now postponed to spring 21 in Baltimore, boasts a translation by Anne Carson, who did our Sappho translation. So let me share glimpses with you quickly of 4 riveting productions, including Yale's. At New York Circle in the Square a generation ago, I saw my own first Bacchae. The distinguished Greek actress Irina Pappas played Agave. And all evening on stage, a great bronze disc caused and reflected the footlights. Continuously in view, this disc glowed, glowered, leered, grinned, grimaced. Seductive and unsettling, its haunting presence seemed to blur comedy and tragedy. What was it? An amalgam of the 2 suns over Thebes, which Pentheus hallucinates when he goes in drag to spy on the Maenads? Or was it the diabolical smiling mask of Dionysus? Brandeis University students staged a Bacchae with throbbing percussion and a wall of crimson styrofoam balls that tumble down as the Theban palace falls in scene 3. 2 students of different race and gender, dramatically other in their vocal range and body language, were simulcast as Dionysus and alternated scene by scene throughout the evening. At the Brooklyn Academy of Music in New York, just imagine a multilingual, gender-neutral Bacchae starring a blonde actress in shiny red pants as Dionysus and a Japanese Agave who crooned her lines with raw emotion in her native language. Finally, at Yale, The Girls, mise en scène flipped so that the Maenads revel on the mountainside and take over the stage to dominate the antagonistic relationship between Pentheus and Dionysus. They party and dance to exciting music until everything turns violent. And what seemed like fun collapses into fear. Pleasurable release and letting go plummet the participants toward disaster, climaxed by a shattering gunshot. Now, in each case, cross-dressing, voyeurism, orgiastic revelry, and resistance to all of that, and dismemberment reflect a world in upheaval. And because Dionysus is god of theater, whose shrine was located traditionally at the center of the orchestra in ancient Greece, the dancing space for the chorus in the ancient Greek theater, the god himself, if we wish to imagine him thus, inhabits each re-envisioning of this play. So one vein of meaning that I want to focus on in this lecture that may account for our abiding fascination with the Bacchae is the entwined theme of self-knowledge and recognition. Pausanias tells us that the maxim, know thyself, was inscribed on the temple of Apollo at Delphi. In the Homeric worlds of the Iliad and the Odyssey, characters identify themselves by their father's name and place of origin. And centuries later, in the late 5th century world of Euripides' Bacchae, these markers still count. Identifying oneself is never complete without corresponding recognition. Knowing who we are intersects with our need to be acknowledged as such. Just recall in your own life that sudden jolt of pleasure when somebody really sees you for who you are and just how you want to be seen and gets you, as we say. And by contrast, how depleting it is when the opposite occurs and you are misjudged or misunderstood. In his Poetics, Aristotle hails recognition as the core of the tragic plot. To illustrate, he cites the moving scene of recognition between Electra and Orestes, which you've just read recently, Agamemnon's bereaved children in the Oresteia. And remember the poignant scenes, one after another, of recognition in the Odyssey, with the old dog Argos, with Euryclea the nurse, with Eumaeus the swineherd, and Telemachus, of course, first, and finally Penelope. Here in the Bacchae, linked notions of identity and recognition form a ligature that binds this drama and drives it toward its inexorable finale. And we find it in the opening lines, which I'm going to read in a moment. The Bacchae asks us to ponder, who am I and who are you? And how much of our real selves can we actually show each other? Can we be both rule breakers and rule abiders? How much freedom can we tolerate before things fall apart and we start to hurt ourselves and each other? Can we practice self-control and righteousness while also being open to ecstasy and mystery and the wild and the unorthodox? Can holding to any extreme avert danger? And are we animal, human, partly divine? Where are the boundaries? Are we male or female, both male and female, or something fluid beyond binary distinctions? Does a higher wisdom imply an acceptance or a denial of these contradictions? The Bacchae, through twinning, merging, overturning, falling, and breaking apart, dramatizes these questions, and Euripides sends us down through the ages, a thrilling and terrifying play, one that could not be more cogent for today. First, a framing thought on interpretation. So, interpreters of the Bacchae, in imitation of its character's partial vision, sometimes fall to one side or another of a perceived divide. Some see it as a glorification of Dionysus and all he stands for: theater, festival, wine, voluptuousness, freedom, transcendence, ecstatic embrace of the senses. Or focusing on its tragic end, others take it as a condemnation of licentiousness and transgression and brutality. But these polemical ways of reading the Bacchae fail to honor its indeterminacy. Euripides pulls our sympathies in one direction and then another, until at last there is only horror and doubt. The uncertain borders between liberty and license, and between order and oppression, drive his play. They are the state out of which human lives are both wrested and arrested. Euripides unfurls a dazzling palette of opposites that reverse into each other, an ambiguity intrinsic to our human condition can bear only fleeting resolution. Centuries later, as Europe was teetering on the brink of catastrophe, Sigmund Freud argued in Civilization and Its Discontents that to be an individual in any human community is to accept prohibitions while craving at the same time to transgress them. Euripides' Bacchae anticipates this thought and hurls it at us in ecstatic poetry and imaginary spectacle. Disaster follows what is too sharply defined and static. Pentheus' very human need to wall things off, to keep the Theban women indoors, to control by means of chains, to fasten down with iron nets, to attack with weapons. He speaks of blindness we can recognize in our own readiness, say, to avoid what scares us because it seems unruly. Pentheus gives up the walls of Thebes and plunges outside its gates into a hallucinatory maelstrom. And there we almost lose him, and eventually he loses himself. Persuaded to forsake his prerogatives of masculine gender and socially conferred power, he ventures out beyond civilization, which is symbolized by the seven gated walls, and he suffers annihilation. These are the extremes that Euripides dramatizes without holding back, extremes meant to be experienced in art, on stage, safely, yet with all their disruptive power. So let's begin.
No. Okay.
I, son of Zeus, have come to Theban soil. I, Dionysus, to whom Semele, Cadmus' daughter, gave a fiery birth, when flames of lightning burst to bring me forth, having changed my shape from God to mortal, now I have come to where two rivers flow, the waters of Dirce and the Ismenos. I see beside the royal house the tomb of Semele, my mother, lightning struck, and here is her ruined house, still smoldering, with the live flame of Zeus, the immortal rage and violence of Hera against my mother. Dionysus has returned to Thebes, and standing before the palace, he aims ringing lines at us. He proclaims his identity, and he wants us to recognize him for who he is. But who is he? Before he even speaks, we note his appearance. Pentheus describes it. I quote, a sorcerer, a Lydian casting spells, his long blonde hair perfumed, his cheeks as red as wine, his eyes with the charm of Aphrodite. So it's a riddle. He's here to affirm his identity as a god, born in a Greek city, but camouflaged as a mortal from Lydia. And even his gender seems moot. He calls himself son of Zeus, and yet he seems feminized. By materializing this way, he provocatively enacts a version of what his father Zeus did to Semele, his mother. For this too is an epiphany, an apparition of the god. Does he mean to shock us? Significantly later in the play, just before the so-called palace miracle in scene 3, Dionysus changes the order of identifications. Now, his mother's name precedes his father's. He says, again I speak, the son of Semele, the son of Zeus. And the catastrophic scene that follows can also be read as a restaging of his father's assault on his mother, complete with pyrotechnics and thunder. If so, the reversed order shows, perhaps, that a child of both parents, Dionysus identifies with the victim as well as destroyer. And so, as in many of the Greek tragedies and in our own lives, the wish to be recognized matters. And yet that wish, throbbing like an ostinato near our beating hearts, is fraught with ambivalence. The very first speech of the Bacchae shows the wish troubled by confusion as to who it is we are actually seeing, even though Dionysus insists with a certainty to be matched later by Pentheus's false certainty about who he is. And the god of theater thus performs a drama about origins, where the yearning to be known is complicated by a need not to be entirely known. He announces his shapeshift into a feminized stranger, and he ornaments his speech with double imagery. Two rivers, Dirce and Ismenos. Double images ensue throughout the Bacchae, reminding us of the ambiguity of human consciousness. Lacking stage directions, we go to the dialogue itself to learn what we are meant to see, to imagine now on stage. The tomb of Semele, my mother, lightning struck, and here's her ruined house still smoldering, says Dionysus. But why these references to a tomb and ruined house that call up the story of the god's dual birth that haunts the play from start to finish? As a newborn, Dionysus emerged from Zeus's thigh after the sudden death of his mother, when, egged on by Hera, the thundering god appeared to her, and she, struck lifeless at the Epiphany, fell at his feet. Dionysus, unborn, never knew his mother, and she, of course, died without knowing him. Why does Euripides invoke this story right at the start? Why is it so important that it comes fast, furious, and remains hovering in the air throughout the play? Well, maternal recognition lies at the heart of a child's burgeoning identity. And from Dionysus' tone, when he speaks of the smoking remnants of his mother's house, he seems marked by his loss of that formative experience. Outraged at Semele's murder by Zeus, he is vengeful over the fate that deprived him of her forever. And so while he proclaims his paternity first, I, son of Zeus, he immediately mentions Semele in the next line and adopts a disguise that undercuts his godly father in two ways. Human, it belies Zeus's immortality, and androgynous, it belies his virility. And we cannot forget Hera's vindictiveness, which we've already met in Homer and will meet again in Virgil's Aeneid. It is worth considering, too, in accordance with the well-known psychological phenomenon that mistreated people often, sadly, mistreat others, that Dionysus, still inwardly smoldering, like Semele's onstage house, behaves maliciously toward the women of Thebes. After all, he maddens them and drives them out, not only to retaliate for their denial of his paternity, his godly paternity, but also in memory of the mistreatment of his mother, for the Theban women had refused to believe she was impregnated by Zeus. And Dionysus confesses his vengeance toward them when he says, every woman of that family I've driven from their homes in a state of madness. And now, together with my mother's sisters, they sit on rocks without a roof beneath the pale green pines. For Thebes must fully learn to spite itself, if need be, what neglect of my Bacchic rituals means. And I, revealed to mortals as the god she bore to Zeus, must speak in defense of Semele, my mother. So Dionysus' relations with his adoring followers are laced with punitive ire. And his pain, the enduring sting of never having been known by his mother, will recur when he metes out punishment to Pentheus. For by avenging the young ruler's denial of him as a god, and in memory perhaps of his own loss, of a chance to be known by his mother, Dionysus will cause Pentheus to suffer a scene of non-recognition by his mother, Agave. Outside the city walls, Agave will fail to know her son. Despite his desperate pleas, she will not recognize him. Broken, cross-dressed, fallen from a treetop, he will lie on the ground at her feet. And the harrowing scene of Dionysus' own birth, remembered at the start of the Bacchae, returns uncannily in this scene of gruesome death. In the first instance, we have a mother who dies before her child's birth and inevitably fails to know him, and later that son returns to the site of her tomb. In the second instance, a living mother, Agave, failing to know her child, becomes the unwitting instrument of his death and eventual entombment. Thus, Dionysus, the god of theater, restages his trauma, and Euripides, by brilliantly masterminding this plot, affords the god redress. Savage payback to his enemy Pentheus, refuses to recognize him. Punishment even for his mother, Semele, who in fantasy abandoned him, for abandonment is the deep irrational fantasy that underlies maternal death experienced in earliest childhood. Identification also with the aggressor, the father, Zeus, through powerful acts of sexualized violence. As a double for Pentheus, he can experience also his own suffering and near annihilation, but this time as perpetrator rather than victim. Here is how the second messenger reports the final scene of non-recognition. Pentheus tears the headband from his hair so that wretched Agave will recognize him and not kill him, and he touches her cheek as he begins to say to her, "Mother, it's Pentheus, your child. It's me. You gave birth to me in Echion's house. Have pity on me, mother." But she cannot. And just as at the start of the play, Euripides here invokes childbirth. Desperate to save himself, Pentheus seeks to awaken his mother's memory of giving him life, and he asks her to do it one more time, give him life. Begging her, he speaks words the motherless Dionysus could not say. But just as Semele was unable to see her son, so Agave cannot see hers. There is no pity. And the horrifying sparagmos will take place. Childbirth, we might add, with its complex sequelae for the identity of Dionysus, appears in the Parados, the entrance ode of the chorus, where, dancing in with flutes and drums, the powerful phallox of foreign women chant. O Dionysus, who once lay curled within his mother in her pangs of childbirth, when to earth flew the lightning of Zeus, and at his thundercap she thrust the child too early from her womb and left this life. Then instantly Zeus, the son of Cronos, took the infant into his own thigh, where he covered him and closed with golden pins this chamber of a womb hidden away from Hera's sight. Childbirth imprints a complex identity on the god and his ambiguous gender. Note the proximity of birth and death. Dionysus is threatened even before birth. Might the experience of being hidden find its echoes in the hidden nature of Dionysian rites, their secrecy, their mysteriousness? Pentheus asks, "These mystic rites of yours, what are they like?" And Dionysus answers, "They must not be known by mortals who are not Bacchae." So bound together, the themes of identity and recognition plague the antagonists as we focus on their common heritage. Manifestly, they oppose one another, and yet they resemble each other and shift place. Let's take a look. Just before the seduction scene, in which Dionysus performs a core aspect of his identity by staging his play within a play, his mise en abîme, Pentheus is furious over the messenger's report that the women are delirious on the mountainside. So he commands his aide to fetch me my weapons. Now, this, I think, is a precise point when Dionysus catches him. Because this call to arms betrays an urgent need on Pentheus' part to destroy what he fears, to smash with weapons of war what he cannot grasp. And Dionysus now proceeds to stage the young ruler's undoing. Cunningly, he asks, do you want to see them sitting together on the mountains? This is a text slide. I think we have to do it. Pentheus, with his ready answer, morphs from being Dionysus' hunter and captor to being his quarry, because he says, yes, I do. And for that, I give a countless weight of gold. But why do you feel such a desire for this? It would give me pain if I saw them drunk, says Pentheus. And yet, Dionysus presses, you'd see with pleasure that which gives you pain. And before our eyes, through a stunning sequence of leading questions, this line-by-line dialogue called stichomythia in Greek, Dionysus, like a brilliant trial lawyer, transforms Pentheus, his former jailer, into his prisoner. Shall we lead you then? He prompts Pentheus. Will you undertake the journey? Lead me as fast as you can, comes the answer. So quick, so rash, just as when we ourselves are fearful and unsure, we move too fast. This waiting irritates me, Pentheus says, and his sense of urgency grows as the ground begins to shake and the roles reverse, and Dionysus now is in command. Put on the ritual robe of linen then. But Pentheus protests. He is a male. Must he disguise himself as female? In what dress? Woman's? But I'd be ashamed. Observers of Bacchic rites, however, must take part. A male dressed as a female stands to lose his identity, but also perhaps extend it. And Pentheus will perform a central paradox of sexual and gender indeterminacy, as with erotic excitement and a primal fear of passivity and humiliation at the hands of women, he accepts the robes while preserving his masculine body underneath. Only intermittently aware, his oscillation between knowing and not knowing impart a tension and thrill of anxious pleasure to his experience, an alternating sense of mastery and terror. Escort me up the widest street in Thebes, since I am the only man who dare to do this, he says. Costumed and implicated, Pentheus becomes an actor in Dionysus' play, an actor disguised as actress. Once the scornful mocker of the stranger's effeminate look, Pentheus primps. How do I appear? Don't you think I'm standing the way Ino, his aunt, stands, or Agave, mother, does? Similar to Dionysus, who cannot forget the wrong done to his mother, Pentheus, too, identifies in his altered state with his mother Agave and with Ino, his aunt. And after rigidly defending the boundaries of a unitary self, he is about to go forth to become the victim of Sparagmos. Like the matched groups of women in the play, the onstage chorus of Bacchae from Lydia On the offstage, Theban Maenads in the hills, Euripides has harnessed Dionysus and Pentheus in tandem. They have become co-participant observers. And excited, the young king leaves the city to observe the Bacchae. He exclaims, "In fact, it seems to me I see two suns, a double seven-gated fortress of Thebes." Double vision proceeds from his altered state of consciousness. And let's imagine him in our mind's eye, his manhood covered by women's garments, his city suddenly twinned before him as he leaves unknowingly forever. His interlocutor, antagonist, and cousin, Dionysus, now suddenly appears to be an animal. "You lead me forward, so it seems, as a bull. You seem to have grown two horns upon your head. Were you all this time an animal?" As Pentheus falls under the Dionysian spell, his perceptions shift and he loses the judgment of which he was so sure. And similarly, we as audience for the Bacchae are meant to reflect on how we try simultaneously to watch ourselves as we live. We too are fated to seek and lose the double vision of our human condition. The genius of the Bacchae lies in its brutal insistence on the necessity for, but utter impossibility of, seeing double. I mean, of being both subject and object to ourselves. The Bacchae's protagonist and antagonist, Dionysus and Pentheus, though human and divine respectively, are doubles. Youthful cousins, their ill-fated mothers, Agave and Semele, were sisters. They are both heirs to an entwined genealogy. Each one seeks to establish a stable identity despite a family history tainted with rape, murder, infanticide, and suicide. We watch them paired in their mutual acts of sadism. They humiliate each other. They replay and redress their past wounds. Colliding and merging, their enmity displays a twinship that is revealed paradoxically through role reversals that occur both within themselves and in their hostile relations. Earlier in the play, the tables were turned, and Pentheus had captured the disguised Dionysus. In that scene, Dionysus, as prisoner, asks, "Tell me what I'll suffer. What terrible thing will you do to me?" And Pentheus replies, "First, I'll have that delicate hair cut off," a line that can be read as an effort to force Dionysus into the strictly masculine role the young king has adopted for himself. The long blonde curls tantalize and repel him. They prevent him, perhaps, from evading his own underexplored sexuality. And Pentheus commands Dionysus to hand over his thyrsus, the ivy-tipped wand that characterized the Bacchae. And here the prelude to the seduction begins. Because what does Dionysus say? He says, "Take it from me yourself." Take it from me yourself. This is crucial. By demanding that Pentheus perform the act, rather than remain passive, Dionysus implicates him in his own desire and forces him to act on his forbidden wish. He refuses Pentheus a place outside the action. So, silently, as Pentheus takes the thyrsus into his own hands, the roles shift. And from that point on, it's Dionysus who will orchestrate and Pentheus obey. By handling the thyrsus, Pentheus puts himself into the hands of the god. Although he gloated that when he finally captures this sensual worshiper of Dionysus, he will, quote, cut his neck clean off his body, it is Pentheus who will appear on stage, an impaled and severed head. And with chilling irony, Euripides overturns the expected. Dionysus taunts his captor by questioning his identity. You don't know what your life is, nor what you are doing, nor who you are. Pentheus confidently replies, as if he were a character straight out of Homer, I am Pentheus, Agave's son. Echyon was my father. Interestingly, he gives his mother's name first. And the costume Dionysus retorts with contempt, your name means grief, and you are suited for it. Like Oedipus in Sophocles' great play, Pentheus does not know who he is. But, whereas Oedipus, by the end of his drama, learns, after great suffering, both what he did and why, Pentheus learns nothing. Disguised, Dionysus informs the chorus of what he will do in these harsh words. Women, the man is heading toward our net. He will come to the Bacchae where he'll meet his justice, death. And now, Dionysus, things will turn your way, for you are not far off. Let's take our vengeance on him. First, derange his mind and put him in a giddy frenzy, for in his right mind, he will never want to wear woman's clothes. But if he drives his chariot off the road of sanity, he'll wear them. And then I want him to be laughed at by everyone when he is led through town, a man turned woman after his terrible threats. I'll go dress Pentheus in what he'll wear to Hades, sacrificed by his mother's hand, and he will know that Dionysus, son of Zeus, was born a god in full and is most terrible to mortals and most gentle. But Pentheus does not know. He will never know. He will die without knowing. Suffering and death bring him no redemption. Themes of identity and recognition and their paradoxes beat at the heart of this tragedy. Vexed equations of vision as knowledge and blindness as ignorance. By foisting his own dilemma on Pentheus, Dionysus reveals their deep twinship. Walled up like the city he rules, Pentheus is blind. Like Oedipus, he recognizes neither his interlocutor nor himself. And at the absolute core of the Bacchae, the question of self-knowledge moves center stage. Before going there, let's just turn briefly to images of falling. Euripides exploits falling at key moments. The Bacchae presents a world in which moderation appears only as a chimera hallucinated by the chorus. Its principles plummet from extreme to extreme, living out with erotized intensity the paradoxes of mortality. Descending images culminate in Pentheus' final fall from the treetop. Hurtling downward, he plummets into the Sparagmos, and then, in the end, he barely escapes being cannibalized. His deranged mother asks that he be eaten. Share this feast, she cries, holding up his impaled head. Falling abounds from the start, worrying about old men like himself in Cadmus at the Bacchic revels. Tiresias asks his friend to help me stay on my feet, and I will do the same for you. It would bring shame on us if we two elders fell. Thus falling, perceived as disaster, can be momentarily averted by the device of doubling, a point echoed when Pentheus receives the two sons over Thebes. In scene 3, Dionysus thunders in imitation of his father and shakes the Theban palace. And awestruck, the women of the chorus replay the role of Semele toward Zeus, and like her, they fall to the ground. Barbarian women, Dionysus asks, are you so startled, so filled with fear that you fall to the ground? And in this scene, the birth trauma is again invoked as Pentheus stumbles helter-skelter in confusion and stabs at phantoms as if he were a child. The Theban palace, symbolizing solidity, might even be interpreted as a secure adult self that collapses in ruins to reveal the helpless infant inside. This last was an idea offered to me by the late beloved distinguished classicist Charles Siegel. Falling images spell physical disaster, grief, and even ecstasy, as when the chorus describes Dionysus hurling himself to the earth. Our Dionysus rejoices when everyone is dancing. How sweet he is in the mountains. When running with his worshippers, he throws himself to the ground. The world of the Bacchae is one of almost perpetual descent, even under the final imagery, where the venerable but impotent Cadmus is transformed by Dionysus into a snake in a closing humiliation, forever destined to touch the earth with all his body parts. Cadmus reverts to the chronic being of his family ancestry. After all, he founded the city of Thebes by slaying a serpent. And he is barred from ever siring future kings. His achievement as a civilizing hero is undone. He has truly fallen. When pondering these images, I'd like to point out that fear of falling is the most primitive of our human fears. This is the fear that causes every human infant to grasp reflexively. It is the fear against which mothers protect with hands and cradling arms. Adumbrated throughout the Bacchae, this fear of falling is actualized in its supreme moment of horror. Pentheus drops not from, but into his mother's unsustaining, life-threatening hands. Losing his grip on the tree that supports him and falling to the ground, he is deprived of life by the very person who was meant to give him life, rent in a total fragmentation of body and mind. And now, at last, we are ready for Agave's great scene, prepared for by the second messenger. But at this point, and please forgive the suspense, I have one final detour regarding form. I just want to point out something particularly brilliant here. Euripides alternates his themes. He gives us representation by spectacle on stage and representation by words alone. In other words, scenes performed on stage and scenes described by messengers. The Bacchic orgy on the mountain and the death of Pentheus have to be imagined in our mind's eye. They are violent and, as Aristotle later writes in the Poetics, should not be staged, but only narrated. Each audience member, with freedom and privacy, can imagine them at will. However, and this is Euripides' genius, passing from one mental state to another happens fully live on stage. So, the seduction of Pentheus by Dionysus and the bringing of Agave to her senses by Cadmus are transitional scenes that reveal the psychological and theatrical brilliance of Euripides' Bacchae. Agave dances on stage with a pike. She presents her father Cadmus with the head of the wild beast she has felled. Rarely in all the annals of theater is there a scene more painful to hear, behold, and absorb than his gentle questioning that will bring her gradually back to herself. For only when Agave realizes who she is can she understand whose head is on the pike she carries and what she has done. And to awaken her step by step from her trance, her father must bring her to a self-knowledge that will cause eternal suffering. Yet bring her back he must, and she in turn must go back. Cadmus begins. Oh, when you begin to understand what you have done, you will suffer terribly. But if, till the end, you were to stay like this, as you are now, you would not be fortunate. Though in your trance, you are not unfortunate. So, which is better? Is it better to know the terrible truth and suffer, or to live under illusion. Great mid-century American plays come to mind. Eugene O'Neill's Long Day's Journey into Night, The Iceman Cometh, Tennessee Williams' Streetcar Named Desire, Arthur Miller's All My Sons. Here in the Bacchae, Agave's father knows he is obliged to bring his daughter back if he can, and he begins. First, just look up a minute at the sky. Agave replies, all right, why do you say for me to look there? Cadmus wants her to locate herself in space, to regain her awareness of place. She is standing on the earth. Above her is the sky. Cadmus seeks to overturn the overturned. He asks her, is it the same, or did it seem to change? He wants her to notice not just the clouds moving overhead outside, but what is occurring in her mind. And she says, speaking, I think, of both, it's brighter than before and seems more clear. But then she seems to lose her ability to retain the conversation. And Cadmus realizes she needs to be situated in time as well as in space. She needs her memory. He asks, to what house did you go when you were married? A simple question, intent to pull her back now into ordered chronology. And then when he feels she's ready, he asks her 3 times to look down at what she is holding. Agave does not want to look. She is afraid to look. Finally, she looks. Cadmus says, look closely now. This lesson. Look closely now and understand it better. Agave looks and recognizes what she is holding. She cannot pronounce her son's name. She can only say, doomed woman that I am, I see the greatest grief. Stop the screen share. By now, the Bacchae has asked us to ponder not only who we are, but how far we are willing to stray, to find that out, and what will happen to us if and when we do. By pointing to its imagery of doubling, overturning, falling, and the merged themes of identity and recognition, I've tried to show how one traumatic childbirth, evoked in the play's first moments, spawns a set of new additions that erupt into and propel its tragic plot. Euripides' masterpiece speaks to us today with unstable answers to riddles that arise in troubling times. To read or see the Bacchae is to confront ourselves. For Euripides' theater is a theater of cruelty, but also a theater of truth. Thank you very much, and please don't hesitate to email me to discuss further if you wish.